Hi, it's Warren Huart here. Hope you're doing marvelously well. So we're going to take a song by the band Little Empire and we're going to mix it over the next few weeks. What's so wonderful about this is you will be able to download the files and follow along with me and try your own techniques, steal my techniques, invent new techniques, use other people's techniques, whatever you want to do. The great thing about this track is the drums are mixed completely on a 2-bus, not going through the console at all. So you're going to see how I blended live drums with a minimal amount of mics and just a couple of samples thrown in there. And you can do whatever you like with it. It's going to be a lot of fun. So once again, we're going to mix this song and you're going to be able to download the tracks and follow along with me. So why don't we start now, and we will start on the drums. So mixing the drums. This song is called Stay New. The artist is called Little Empire. The reason why I chose this band, and I've chosen them a few times for Academy members, because they have a combination of organic instruments and programmed. So you can take them either direction. You can make the drums more programmed sounding. You can focus on the keys and go a little bit more dance music, or you can focus on the guitars and go a bit more indie rock, or somewhere in the middle. That's what's great about this band. The singer is fantastic. She's a great, great singer. We treat this like a pop indie kind of project. So let's get started. Let's break it down, listen to all the individual elements. I'll show you what I did, and of course, download the files and mix these drums. Okay, so a couple of things. I have this beautiful wide screen here, and quite often I'll separate it off and I'll put the mix screen over here as well. But because we're using ScreenFlow, for those of you who are interested, it ends up squashing the screen, because if I stretch all the audio out here, we'll chop some of it off. So that's the reason why you're seeing some more additional real estate there. Normally, I would do this. I would pull these out here, and I might do that, but we're not going to for this. So those of you that are going to ask me about that, that's the reason why. It just makes it quite a lot easier when it comes to editing it down. Cool, so here's just the live drums. So I'm going to go into suspend groups, which is Shift Command G, or for those of us that are old enough to remember the old Apple, that used to be Shift Apple G. So if you're in Pro Tools, Shift Command G. Okay, so I'm just going to solo the kick, the snare top, the snare bottom, the rack, the floor, the hat, and the overheads. So here's the live kit. This is with plugins on, but with no samples. So it's plugins on, EQ and compression on the individual elements. And also, if we go down here on our drum bus, which I'm highlighting here, I've got an MV2 and an L2. So we can leave those in plain view, plain sight for a second. You'll notice in Pro Tools, if you take this on and off, it keeps both plugins open at the same time. So I'm able to continually add plugins as long as I turn this little light off here. Okay. So the MV2 is giving us a little bit of low level and high level compression. Basically what it does is it's almost acting like a parallel compressor. It's adding low level energy in the track. If I go and pick up, I don't know, a few bars here, turn both of them off for a second, bring the MV2 on. I love what it does. It takes the bottom and the top and just pushes them together. So yes, it does reduce the dynamics, but look, this drummer is incredibly dynamic. Here's an individual snare hit here, for instance, when he first comes in. It's pretty dynamic, but look at what he's doing in that verse. It's coming up and down, up and down. And I have got a little bit of fun going on in that snare top, but not a lot. What I did is, honestly, is I built a drum part that I really, really liked. Hence why it's a little bit more undynamic than you might expect if you listen to the chorus here. You can probably tell it's repeated. It's just what we do. Is like when I recorded this, I was still messing around with the idea of what the drum should be. So, you know, it's not necessarily the drummer that I copied and pasted these two sections here. This part is identical to this part. It's just that we had different variations, and when I got it the way I wanted it to be, I may have edited it and think that is exactly the feel I want. It's just a production choice. I then put it in the chorus twice. So that's why it sounds repetitive. Having said that, you know, if in the great scheme of things, it's 2 moments in a chorus. So, you know, but we've always done that. Even when we're on tape, people would take sections and splice it and then put them in. So, you know, bear that in mind. It's not always wrong to copy and paste things. It's just when you get into a situation where like copy and paste like the same bar across the whole song, you're going to have no dynamics at all. What we're doing here is we're taking a section we love and putting it into the song. Okay, so it's a pretty dynamic performance. Obviously, the snare is consistent through here because we took sections we liked, etc. But ultimately, even with the MV2 helping us, a little bit more energy. You see we're getting about 2 occasional here, 2 dBs worth of, potentially 2.5 to 3 dBs worth of gain reduction. You know, we're getting that on the L2 as well. Now, we've got some other fun things to add then. So let's add in the addictive drum kick here. Now, before we start talking about the EQ and the compression, etc., I've done on anything in particular, or any kind of, you know, transient designer on here, let's see why I did it. So why did I do what you just heard there? Here's the live kick with no EQ at all on it. It is literally just a mic on the outside head. There's no hole in it, so it's not rock at all. It's just a boomy kick. Now, the way this drummer plays is he lays his kick drum into the head. So instead of doing this and getting that he gets He's laying it onto it, and it's kind of choking out a bit. Have a listen. He's doing this as opposed to. Hopefully that makes sense. And that's fine, but it's a different kind of performance thing. It really depends on what you're going for. Bonham, you know, you think of that like perfectly played kick drum where it just kind of like feels like it's like boom, boom. I've never seen John Bonham plays kick. I don't think anybody ever filmed it, but if they had filmed his foot, I would imagine that, you know, even with the Speed King, it was bouncing away from the head and letting the whole drum ring. Now, Joey Kramer, who I've recorded from Aerosmith, is a fantastic drummer, but he puts his beater into it, so he gets like da, 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 da. 2 completely different approaches. That's what this drummer is doing here. But you still hear You still hear a little bit of ring. Okay, so that's not bad, but that's the nature of it. Now, I've done some really drastic EQ to try and get rid of that on my REQ. So if you see what I'm doing some 60 boost, which is very typical. But this is probably a little bit more drastic than what most people would do. Here's 143 hertz pulled out by 10.5 dB. So pretty drastic. Then 682 hertz. So like there's a massive dip of mid-range here. It's pretty wide, and I've just sucked out a lot of mid-range, and then I'm boosting at 5K. So let's do it without and with. Here's without. And with. Dramatic results. To me, what it's doing is it's keeping the characteristic of the kick drum, that it's a kind of a big woolly kick with no hole cut in it, but it's exaggerating what we love about it. And that's the at the bottom, the 60 hertz, and a little bit of the attack. It's hard to get attack when you've got a kick drum mic on the outside of the kick. But with the EQ, here it's boxy, tons of mid-range, low mids that you don't want. There it is there. Okay, so next up is a trim, which we're not even using. I probably loaded the trim in there just in case I wanted to rebalance going into the next plugin. So not being used. Okay. After that, it gets even more drastic. So here's the kick. Pretty good sounding. There's bleed of the hi-hat. I'm fine with that. What else would you expect? You've got the mic just on the outside of the kick. Okay, so this is really drastic EQ again, but it's again in the characteristic. There's no low boost. We've already boosted 60 like crazy, so don't do any more. But there's a lot more 400 and a lot of 7K. So we're exaggerating the low cut. Now, as I'm sure you're all smart enough to realize, boosting and cutting is almost the same thing anyway. It's just characteristics of EQs. You know, when people say not to high pass, but then they boost everything above that area, they're still effectively doing the same thing. Because if you go to 60 hertz and, you know, boost that like crazy and boost your 2.5 like crazy, it's the same as high passing below 60, you know, in a nice gentle slope and cutting out all the mid-range. You know, it's just the characteristic of the EQ. Some EQs, like SSL EQs, are famous for being really good at boosting into compression. That is the sound of an SSL. Look at Chris Algae. Look at the way he boosts his high end into compression and gets that spanky sound. It's a really, really popular sound on an SSL. Tracking at Sunset Sound, for instance, they have API EQs in 2 of their consoles. And the way that the Jensen transform, but basically the way that those mic pre's sound fantastic is you drive them hot and you drive the EQs really hot. And that's when you get the console to sound really good. So that argument about boost and cut really comes down to what kind of EQs you're using. Some EQs are surgical cutting EQs. Some of them have a real sound. I actually like this Waves simulation or emulation of an API. I don't know how close it is to our 550 because I've never actually, even though I've got 550s over there or here, I've never actually compared it directly, but I do like the sound of it. And I like it for doing anything. And here I am boosting and cutting. So have a listen. It's basically doing more of what I've already done. The 7K in. It's just toughening up that top end. There's not a lot of top end to get there. So sometimes when you do things like that, and this is where things get really, really, this is where it gets a little contentious because a lot of things that you do, like boosting 7K, may not make sense when you hear a sound that doesn't have any real high end on it. Okay, but why do you do that? You know, I have people write and say, oh, you know, you boosted 7K or you do this and it didn't really make a huge amount of difference. Well, this is why. So here is our 20 to 20K frequency response. Here's 7K. When you're boosted on the API here, it pulls everything up gently in a very nice gentle slope. You know, it's got that kind of bell curve. So the point is like it's gently pulling up other high frequencies with it. It's not just going 7K, blip, pull up like this. It's a very smooth kind of build up. So look, if you hear it with and without, even though there is 6 dBs worth of 7K, it's not like super brittle. Take it off. Back on. Just adds a little bit of hardness to the top of it. That just reinforces that. Because that area there is more in the 2.5, that duck, 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 that kind of sound. That's the Dave Jordan famous 2.5 that you hear on like Alice in Chains and stuff like that. He goes to like 2.5. I think that the 400 cut is the biggest difference. If I take that off, put it back on, off, I think that's the biggest difference using this API, cutting that 400 so dramatically. And I learned that from using it on real life when I was mixing on a console with API EQs. pulling 400 out like that drastically on it made it sound really, really good. So there's my live kick. So let's take all of those three things off. Woolly, natural, but woolly sounding. Let's put them back on. A little bit more aggressive, not metal, but more aggressive, but still keeping that kind of front head, you know, on, no hole. Okay, so let's have a listen. Why would we need to put a sample? We've just got this one kick drum, and it sounds pretty good. Sounds cool. However, there's a lot of stuff going on in this production. Not like a full orchestra, but definitely enough stuff. Have a listen to the chorus.
I need you to stay new, the rest is getting old. Now that the gold that's shone around me only radiates through you, I need you to stay.
So you can hear there, you've got like synths going, there's a pad, there's live guitars, there's a program bass and a live bass as well. So there's a lot of energy. Even though it's not death metal or anything like that, it's still dense. So our tubby kick, even though it's EQ'd and more aggressive, it's still going to get lost in there. So the one sample that we're adding is this one up here. Take the transient designer off. To me, it's exaggerating what's already good about it. So I've got 6 dBs worth of attack and 3 dBs worth of sustain. I think it's just kind of a balance. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous, but if I do 3 dBs worth of attack and keep the sustain where it is, it's not quite the same sound. But have a listen. Here's before, after. So it's giving us that hardness, that toughness that we want, that gaw, 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 gaw. So nice tough sounds. Stick it together with the live kick and we get this. Take the sample off, making a big difference in that mid-range. So as you can see, I'm not doing a huge amount of EQ or anything to that sample against the live kick. What I'm doing is I'm making a choice of using a sample that I like against it that I know will work really, really well. Now, when you're using Addictive Drums or Slate Trigger or Easy Drummer, any of the ones that you prefer, a lot of the process is choosing the right sound to go with it. And that sound worked really well for me. That's like one good kick drum. Take the live kick out. It's good. But add that in, I get the lows that I want. And I don't mind the bleed. The bleed gives it some really cool energy to have a little hi-hat. I want it to be real. Now, just for the chorus, just while we're here, there is another thing that gets added, and that is a synth kick. Let's listen to the synth kick on its own. As I said, this band has dance elements. It's a young band. They're in their early 20s, so they're adding that kind of thing to it. And I think for an example, what we'll do is we'll take the last couple of bars of the chorus going into the first couple of bars of verse 2, so you can see the difference in the kick drums. So you're going to hear the sample kick and the live kick together, but you're also going to hear the synth kick coming in and out. Here it is. See the extra weight? If you're on headphones, it'll be a lot easier to hear directly as opposed to computer speakers, but obviously if you are listening through studio monitors, you'll really hear the bottom end difference. It's adding some length to it, which is really good for the kind of dance kind of feel. So let me take it out of solo and listen to the full band with that kick in. Okay, so I'm going to take a little tiny loop at the end of the chorus here, and we're going to bring the synth kick in and out so you can hear the difference. So this is without the synth kick. out,
Radiates to you, stay new, stay new.
in.
To you, stay new, stay new.
So I think that's quite important to me to get that kind of disco, dance, more modern feel. Funny to say disco and more modern, but you know, to make it sound a little hipper, it's cool to have that in. So that's coming in just in the choruses, but it stays in through the bridge, etc. You know, once it returns on the second chorus. Okay, so that's all of our kick drums. So it's pretty straightforward. Like I said, it's about choosing live kick and things that are going to work with it. I have a sample that I'm using, and as you can see, I'm being dynamic with it here on the bridge here, and the breakdown chorus, it's coming down dramatically.
Let's never change, we're at our best.
So even though the kick, the synth kick stays thump, thump, thump the whole time, my live kick here is pretty dynamic, and my sample kick here is come down quite dramatically and builds here. It's less dynamic. I just control the MIDI files a little bit more, and then the synth kick just thumps through. So you get.
Let's never change, we're at our best.
So, you know, it's a great kind of tool to add these kind of elements, and it's really about choosing the right sounds that work with each other. Okay, so that's our kick drums. Next up is our live snare top. Let's go to that first chorus. So it's kind of a cool little disco small 70s snare, but I've done quite a lot. Firstly, I'm using time adjuster. Now this is my thing that I like to do. So what does the time adjuster do? Well, the time adjuster adjusts the polarity so that it is in phase, the phase is coherent and the polarity is correct between the snare top and the overhead. So as you can see here, you know, it's averaging out, it says 122 there. You know, it's 166, 155. I'm pulling it back, roughly speaking. See 127. Basically the point is it's averaging out about 130 to 140 samples that it's nudging the snare back in phase with the overheads. Why do I do that? Well, firstly, I don't have any lows to speak of in my overheads. Not like super, super lows. If we listen to my overheads, for instance, I'm using them for an overall view of the kit. There are no room mics in this drum recording. It's recorded in this room over here. There are no room mics. Why are there no room mics? Well, the room is about this big. No, all joking aside, it's about the size of maybe a normal kid's bedroom, if that. It's a small bedroom, a smallish bedroom. And I put room mics up there. And sometimes I use them if I'm just going to crush one mic and be the drum sound. But in reality, if I want a bigger drum sound than I recorded with just those limited amount of mics, that's where I fake it. That's where I create ambience. And that's what we're going to talk about now with the snare. As you can hear, there's reverb on the overheads. Most importantly, there's no super, super lows. They're EQ'd out. The point of that is I drag my snare back using time adjuster, as you can say, an average of 137. So the snare top and the overheads sound like they're phase coherent and the polarity is correct. And you'll get this. No snare. With snare. Take the time adjuster off. Snare. Let's do this, I'll show you. So I'm going to take a couple of bars. It's pretty dramatic. It's pretty drastic, pretty dramatic, and pretty drastic. So here is, with the time adjuster on, listen to the snare and the overheads together. Nice snappy snare, little bit of body. Now let's turn the time adjuster off. All the warmth from the bottom end has gone out. Put it back in. It's got more aggression to it because the lows now are coherent. Low frequencies are the first things you're going to hear cancel themselves out. You've got big, fat, low frequencies like this. So if they are slightly off from each other, they start canceling each other out. If you've got super, super high frequencies that are, incredibly detailed, moving in millimeters, less than inches or whatever, it's very, very hard to get exact phase cancellation, obviously. But with low frequencies, it's very easy to do that. You'll find on drums, well, most instruments, but particularly on drums, if you've got multiple kick drum mics and they're all slightly off of each other, you end up with a really thin kick sound. And the same could be said of the snare drum. So you see, I'm using time adjuster, just bring it back to the overheads enough that the warmth is back. So I obviously also do that with the snare bottom. Is both mics, no time adjuster. Both mics with time adjuster. Just that body's coming back. Now, a lot of what I do, and this is why I think does lose a lot of people, is subtlety. I do bass compression, which brings in like a dB or two of lows on a multiband. And I'll show you later what the difference is so you can see it. It just evens out the bottom end just by a couple of dB. It takes peaks and then just pushes them back in. But I always put that early in my chain, so when I'm boosting a more even signal. But these are subtle things, and it confuses a lot of people because they're like, well, he's not doing very much, it's barely touching it. Well, that's kind of the point. One of the things that you'll hear from Howard Willing, and I hear from Andrew Sheps all the time, is like they get sessions to mix. Howard was talking about this, Ken Sluter was talking about this recently. They get sessions to mix, and they've had lots and lots of plugins, which is not necessarily right or wrong, just a lot of plugins in, but with so many EQ moves, so many drastic pull in and pull out, which can be good. Hey, we just did that with the kick drum, but sometimes is overdone to such a point that the realness, the natural sound of the instrument has been destroyed. And then they ease back on that EQ and they find it comes back to life. They send that back to an artist and the artist is like, wow, what have you done to the mix? And like, Howard was saying when I interviewed him, he's like, all I've done is relax a lot of that aggressive EQ and suddenly it sounds fatter and more natural. It's not necessarily about the high passing, it's about that detailed pulling in and out, these really crazy EQ points, which can be really, really good in EDM. Because if you've got really fat signals, you might want to pull out different instruments and create slots for them. It's really good in very, very heavy rock, because you might want to pull out frequency bands to make snare drum attack come in and out. But on pop rock and stuff like that, depending on the density of the mix, you might want to do a little less EQ and do subtler moves, which, as I said, has confused some people. They're like, you didn't do very much. Well, the not doing very much is part of why it sounds like that. Just evening out the bottom end by a dB or two doesn't sound like a big deal. But to me, it's a big deal because after that, I'm boosting other EQs and using like, R bass or whatever on a bass guitar, for instance. And if it's even going in, when I boost that, it's nice and even coming out. Subtle moves are really, really tasteful. Now, obviously, when you're talking subtle moves, that doesn't always work if something is really badly recorded. If there's some terrible boomy frequency in your bass guitar, like, it's like da 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 boo, da 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 boo, you're gonna have to get more aggressive on the EQ. So there is no one size fits all. There are no experts telling you that one thing that you do will work on every bass guitar, or in this instance, every snare drum. But important thing to think about. With this snare here, we're just getting that phase as good as we can, just so it works with the overheads. Right. Okay, so what have I done EQ-wise? Let's just do the snare top on its own. The time adjuster we've talked about, you understand why phase, polarity is really important. Well, the first thing I did was use the Q10. And the reason I like this is because it's a really very subtle EQ. What I mean is it doesn't color it that much, but it's really good at detail. And you see here, I've got a very, very tight Q, which is like, instead of like pulling this big chunk of frequency out, I'm pulling a really narrow point. Well, what did I pull out? I pulled out 220. So if you listen to it, nice cracky snare. Take it out. You hear that? Gone. Again, there's actually a lot of EQ, minus 18 dB at 219, 220. So a snizzle load of pulled out, but the end result, because it's such a tight cue, is just a little, getting rid of a little bit of the ooh. Ooh, ooh. Okay, great. Snare bottom did nothing too. Let's have a listen to it. There's even some kick bleed in there. I don't care. This is a live kit. I want that bleed in there as well. Okay, so back to the snare top. Put our Q2 back in. There's a gate on it. Take the gate off. You can see why. A lot of bleed. It's also going obviously through the MV2 and the L2, which are squashing and increasing all of that bleed. Take that off. Bring in a lot of level. And because of the MV2 is bringing up that low level stuff and adding some energy back in, creating that kind of illusion of a parallel drum action. So I'm not doing any parallel on this at all. I might on other tracks, but not on this. Here it goes back on. Give me that nice, tight 70s snare drum that I want. And then next up is some low mid cut at about 470. High passing at 64, keeping out of the way of the kick. Subtle. Let's bypass that and you'll hear it without the EQ. Boxy. Bo, bo, bo. It's kind of a boxy sound. So there is a 470 pulled out and you can really hear that being taken out. It's without it, no EQ. Oh, oh, now. Now it's just back to that sound. I just wanted that disco snare. And we did a little bit of work in the room. You know, we're moving fast. We dampened it down. We got as close to it as we could, given the amount of time. And now the rest of it we're doing with a little bit of gating and with EQ. So here's the two snares together. Quite a lot of the bottom snare. And I think the reason why I went with a lot of bottom snare was the addition of our snare sample. Let's just listen to our snare sample. Aggressive. Again, not being used in that intro because we've got a tom part. But when it comes in, it's pretty aggressive. It's a big part of this snare sound on this song. So what have I done to it? I've got some time adjuster. Now the reason why I've got time adjuster on it is because I laid it against in phase with the live snare. Okay, so if you see here, it's interesting because to get good phase correlation, you see here, for these snares to be in, it's actually not in the same transient. The very first hit isn't exactly lined up, but it does give us good polarity. I often think about this because I think polarity in samples is massively important. But I must tell you, when I was working on the last Aerosmith record, we got access to tapes of a record from the 80s, and a big record. And when I transferred it, we baked the tapes, we transferred it into Pro Tools. The samples that have been laid in were triggered by a gate, possibly a 4-at, but we're talking very old technology. And the samples in the live snare were like this. And it's still one of the best sounding records of all time. So phase, polarity, everything is really important except when it isn't. That sounds hilarious, but here's where we have to be really careful. We should always, at the best of our ability, keep our phase coherent and our polarity. Is what makes things sound punchy. It makes them cut through is when everything is lined up as near as darn it. but there is plenty of times where it's an approximation, especially here on snare samples where you're picking a place. I'm picking a place where the live and the sample fit close enough to sound good to me. So I've just scrolled down to the bottom here, and if you see down at the bottom here, there's the kick and the snare melodyne that we use to trigger the sounds. I'll make sure that those come in your session. Hopefully it will translate to other DAWs, but we can definitely put that in your session here. Okay, so we have all of the snare elements. Here is all three going at once. No. Adding a lot. This snare sample is adding a lot. Completely own it. After I got that dry, small snare sound, I wanted the rock added, so I wasn't going to get the rock added, so that's where the snare sample comes in. You know what? Schnizzle happens. You've got to be prepared as a mixer and a producer to, you know, change for the best. And if that's what you need to do to make it better, then great. Here's the EQ I applied. Here's without. A little going on. But I wanted the low lows because our little 70s snare had given me that piff, piff, piff sound that I wanted, but I didn't have the oh. So as you can see, I boosted the lows at 100 on the snare to give it some real low lows. I've done a lot of work on the live snare in the miking and in the EQ that it was a little kind of 70s, and I liked it, but I lacked the bottom end. So I boosted the 100 to give me some body on the bottom end. Now, there's not a lot of that in the snare. It's the same principle I did with the kick that we did on 7K. I go to the lowest point and I boost, and it just brings up all of the lows. But at the same time, I cut at 336. If I hadn't cut at 336, it would have boosted a lot of ugly, see here, a lot of ugly low mids. See what it's doing? So I've cut the 336 there, that area there, to get rid of some of those ugly low mids that would have been boosted by the 100. But the thing about boosting that 100 is it gave me a nice gentle slope of boost. You can visually see it on there. So it's nice. Again, there's not a lot of 100 on that, but it's a gentle way of grabbing the lows and pulling them up. It's a really good way of solving that. Again, an understanding of EQ, that you're not always just going and pinpointing the exact frequency, you're creating gentle slopes around it so that it's boosting the lows, but it's not just going 100 boost, you know, 336 cut, you know what I mean? It's nice and gentle slopes. Okay, and then I've got basically 4K, 3914, just boosted on the top. We can take that out. Bring it in. Doing a lot. It's enhancing the inherent bottom snare in that sample. Put them all together. What do you get? You get this. A nice snare sound. Now, obviously, the sample's pretty heavy on this one. So the two things that I'm doing, we're finally hearing some reverb, are the snare, specifically a snare verb. So if I turn this fake room off, you'll hear what I mean. And this snare verb is at 123, so it's just over a second. It's quite a big room size. It's 100% affected, obviously. But the EQ you see here is not super high. At about, you know, 2 or 3K here, 2K, it's sloping off dramatically. At about 250, it's also sloping, not that dramatically because there's not many lows in it, but it's more of a mid-range reverb, more of an aggressive reverb, not super highs. I don't need to get up there and 7K and boost it. It will just sound like a lot of information that's going to get in the way of other instruments. So I'm EQing inside of the plugin itself. Inside of the Renaissance reverberator, I'm using this EQ here. You can put an EQ before or after a reverb as well if you want to shape the reverb. And then I'm using the MV2 again, giving me level. Giving me level, and it's also giving me an evenness, making that decay feel a little stronger. It's reducing the initial attack and bringing up the decay by squashing the bottom and the top like that. Okay, The next reverb, let's hear it without reverb. The next reverb we're using is the fake room. Now what the fake room is doing, yes, you guessed it, is creating a room tone that several mics are going into. It's a lot smaller. It's 0.65 of a second, and I'm not taking the top end off. So it's giving me like a smaller, bright room, which is the exact opposite of what I've got. I've got a small, pretty small, dry, not very exciting room because it's pretty well treated. It's got a ceiling that's like this. It's got bass traps in the corner. And even though there's glass on this side, the kit is on the other side and all the mics are kind of facing away from it. There's nothing really super bright about my room. Plus I've got a 60s Ludwig in there with old heads. It's dull sounding, but I like it and I can manipulate it. It's all about like, what do you have? Is your drum room like concrete? Is it a garage? You know, you can make do with what you have, and then you can get creative on the miking. You can individually mic, you can pull a mic back. You can have so much fun with it. It's not always about the perfect room, because I don't believe there's such a thing. I'm sure there's lots of people who will tell you there is a perfect room and you're doing it wrong or whatever. We all know that kind of world, but the reality is like you get creative. I have a smallish, quite dead room, despite the amount of glass. It's pretty darn dead. So this gives me what makes me feel like I've got a room about twice the size, but also happens to have a little bit of air to it, a little brightness. So before, after. Great. Mix in the snare verb. There's no high-end competition because I've taken it out. Take it out. So it's just adding a little bit of ambience, which is more mid-rangey, is not interfering with the ambience, the high-end ambience that I've got with the fake room. Now, along with the fake room, other instruments are going in. The overheads, as we listened to earlier, are going in there. Take it off. Pretty lifeless room. Now, why am I feeding my overheads into the reverb? Because I don't have any room mics, and the overheads, because they're measured in phase with the snare, so that they create accurate polarity, they feel accurate around the drums. For instance, if we go to the toms here. So what they're doing is they are creating an illusion of room mics by doing that, because they are my most accurate way of hearing my drum kit. So while we're at overheads, let's talk about the overheads because they're affecting the sound quite dramatically. We'll come back to the toms and the hat in a second. So the first thing is I've got an L1 on it. Not doing much. Let's go to a more aggressive area and see what they're doing. Okay, so that's where you hear what it's doing. So it's just taking off the transients of the loudest toms. Not doing anything, then does something. Bypass it. Put it on. Now, you don't hear a dramatic difference at all. It's pretty subtle what it's doing. Again, it comes back to that thing of doing subtle moves, which you may not have to do or may have to do. It's kind of a catch-22. If it's badly recorded and there's a lot of like really weird frequencies in there, or it's so dynamic, then you'd have to do more than this, more dynamic control, more EQ, etc., etc. But the way this works, the way that the L1 works is this link control. If I bring it down, it links the output and the input together so it doesn't change the perceived volume. So let's take it off, bypass. Put it on. So all it's doing is controlling those aggressive transients in a beautiful way without really changing the output. This reminds me of the beauty of the automatic gain of an SSL. When you EQ into compression, you change the nature of the sound. You get that spankiness, but the compressor reads it and adjusts the output gain. So there's no massive perceptible volume change. There's just more of an aggressive sound as the EQ is pushed back in. It's one of the great things about an SSL console that people love. It's that sound that it has and that ability to kind of get and play with it without ruining a mix. You can boost frequencies, and because they're going into the compressor, they just change the characteristics of how you hear it, the sonics of it, but the level doesn't dramatically increase. So that's why I like the L1 for these kind of instances. If I bring that link control and bring it down, it's a way to balance my mix, the sounds of my mix, the transients and stuff, without dramatically rebalancing it in a way that I would have to go back and try and figure out why the overheads now suddenly sound wrong. So subtleties. Okay, so what EQ am I doing? Well, I'm doing a little 200 cut, a little 400 cut, and some 10K boost. I'm boosting the air on the top, and I'm bringing out some of the low mids. And then I'm using the 2500. Some of you heard me talk about this. I don't know if this sounds exactly like a real 2500. And I've talked about this before, but in all reality, I don't really mind because I really like the compressor version of this. So that's doing more color than the L1. Take it off. Put it on. Let's put it on those last couple of bars. Take it off. Put it back on. I think it's bringing out some of the natural beauty of the toms, subtly the if you have a listen. Let's get in there on those sections. See how it's exaggerating that? It's catching the peaks. I mean, I can hear the but now. I like the way it's catching the front attack and then it's releasing fast enough that you get a da-oo. Because I want natural tom sounds as much as possible. Take it off. Pretty tasty. I like this plug-in version on here. Okay, great. So that is everything going on with the overheads. So let's throw overheads, all of the snares, and the kick together. Let's take it away from toms for a bit and just go into our chorus again. Just have a listen to those elements. So it's pretty massive. Snare verb back in. There it is. I mean, it's thick sounding. With that synth kick, there is a load of like low mids and toughness about it. You could get really aggressive on the EQing that and make more room for the bass. I kind of like it though. Full band.
Now that the gold that's shone around me only radiates through you, I need you to stay new. It radiates through you. Stay new, stay.
There it is. So that's the basic drum sound. Let's go and solo those toms just so you can hear what they're doing. Now, I have done work to these toms, which is probably not typical for most people, but this is the stuff I do. I have separated those out. As you can see, I have gained down. Now, there is no perfect way to do toms. Some people like to do what I did and gain down between. Some people cut them out. I think that's a little aggressive to cut them out. I mean, you could get more, that's about as aggressive as I would get. I mean, you can hear a little bit of bleed in between. It's almost completely gone though. So it's actually quite aggressive, to be honest. That's probably about as aggressive as I would get. Now, you could volume alternate, you could draw those up, you could run gates. I don't personally run gates anymore. I try to avoid putting gates on them only because you might miss a tom, you might miss a subtle thing. It's so easy now in pretty much any DAW to draw in what you need to get the toms to be the volume you want them to be, to push through where you want them to be. You can compress them or you can draw them in louder, you can volume ride them in any particular way. Here, I haven't done a huge amount in some ways. Let's have a listen to the rack alone. Here's the R bass, it's doing a lot. Put it on. It's giving a lot of body. One more time with it on. Take it off. Back on. Okay, so not a huge amount done. I didn't even pull out the low mids. This is very unusual for me. I didn't get too crazy on this. I think I just let it be a thicker sounding than I normally would. Like they say, there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat. Whatever that means. There's so many different ways you can do this. Normally I'd pull out like 350 quite dramatically, but I'm letting it breathe. It's quite thick. I mean, we could get in there and do this. I like it. I've just liked it. So all I've really done there is high pass at 76, just to get it out of the way, the kick. But I've got a lot of R bass going on it to give it all that body. On the floor, R bass again. REQ, same thing, lows. But in this instance, I'm using an L1. Why am I using an L1? Well, let's zoom out. This is why. It's pretty darn dynamic. You know, here, for instance. If I do that without the L1 on, back on. Off. So you can see it's just really controlling those excessive peaks there, just so it's limiting the dynamic range. It's not getting rid of it entirely, but it's limiting it. So that is all of the drums. So thank you ever so much for watching that. That is the drum breakdown. Now, what I'd love for you to do as we go through these files, like you're going to download all the files here, so you can mix the whole song now. Or of course, you can keep watching and see how I mixed all the other elements, whatever you wish to do. When you've mixed these, please post it to our Facebook page. Please post it to the Produce Like a Pro Facebook page. Just post up on there and tag Little Empire in it. Tag the band so they can have a listen and they can comment as well. I will tease Lily until she goes there and listens to every single one of them. So I'd love it if you mixed it and tagged the band and post it to Produce Like a Pro Facebook page. Every single one of you rock. This is the best community ever in the history of communities. No, I just love it. It's so wonderful. Thank you ever so much for being a great supporter of the channel. I really appreciate it. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon.